Have you ever stopped to wonder whether everything you've heard about the mark of the beast is actually correct, or if part of that story may have been oversimplified over time? Because there's an uncomfortable truth that almost no one mentions when this topic comes up in videos, sermons, or debates online. A large portion of the popular explanations about the mark of the beast didn't come from the earliest traditions of biblical interpretation. They came much later. For decades, millions of Christians have been taught to imagine the mark of the beast as something extremely specific: a chip implanted in the body, a barcode hidden beneath the skin, a technological system that one day would control every purchase, every sale, every movement people make. Maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you even felt that chill while imagining a world where no one could buy or sell without accepting a mysterious mark. And honestly, at first glance, that idea seems to make sense. After all, the Book of Revelation talks about a mark on the right hand or the forehead. It talks about economic control. It describes a powerful system that influences the entire world. So it's easy to connect those images with modern technologies, digital systems, or theories about global control. But here's the point almost no one notices. When we go back to the history of biblical interpretation, when we look at how the texts of Revelation were studied over the centuries, something curious begins to appear. This highly technological reading of the mark of the beast wasn't the main interpretation among many early theologians. And that might sound normal, but it isn't, because for nearly 2,000 years, scholars, priests, monks, and theologians studied Revelation trying to understand the meaning behind its symbols. And within that long tradition of interpretation, preserved in biblical commentaries and theological reflections, the mark of the beast was often understood in a very different way from what circulates today on social media. This is where things start to shift. When we talk about biblical interpretation within the Christian tradition, especially when the subject involves symbols connected to the end times, there is one institution that has been part of that theological conversation for centuries: the Vatican, not only as a religious authority, but also as the guardian of an immense collection of studies, documents, and commentaries that have crossed generations. For centuries, theologians connected to the tradition of the Church reflected deeply on the Book of Revelation. They analyzed the historical context, the symbolic language used by its author, the connections with the Old Testament, and the spiritual messages hidden behind those apocalyptic images. And the more you look at that process, the more you realize that the real question may never have been simply what technology the mark will be. That's the part almost no one talks about, because in many of those studies, the mark of the beast appears connected to something far deeper than a physical object, something related to loyalty, spiritual identity, and the choices human beings make when they are faced with power and truth. If that sounds familiar to you, stay with me, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Maybe the greatest confusion about the mark of the beast isn't in the text of Revelation itself, but in the way we've learned to interpret it over time. And when we begin to look at this symbol more carefully, we start to realize that the discussion isn't only about prophecy or future events. It also involves something even more intriguing: how different Christian traditions, including the Vatican itself, have understood this symbol throughout history. And that's exactly where a question appears that completely changes the perspective of this conversation. If the mark of the beast hasn't been interpreted the same way in every era, then what exactly does the tradition of the Church teach about this feared symbol from the Book of Revelation? And maybe, as you're listening to all of this, a quiet question is starting to rise somewhere inside you, because many people grew up hearing certain explanations about the Book of Revelation without ever really having the chance to slow down and look at the subject more carefully, with a little more depth. And when we begin to revisit those ideas, when we start to realize that some of the popular interpretations may not tell the whole story, something interesting happens. Curiosity wakes up. We begin to want to understand more. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. Maybe at some point you heard about the mark of the beast in a way that created fear, confusion, or even that strange feeling that something much bigger was hidden behind what seemed like just a theory. And if this conversation we're having right now has brought back some of those old questions, those quiet doubts that may have stayed with you for a long time, it would be interesting to hear your perspective too, because one of the most fascinating things about topics like the Book of Revelation, the symbols of the end times, and the theological interpretations that have traveled across centuries, is that every person arrives here carrying a different story. Some people grew up hearing these passages inside the church. Others discovered these texts much later, maybe through personal study, maybe through books, videos, or conversations. Like this one. If this topic resonates with you, tell me in the comments what has caught your attention the most so far. It could be an old question you've carried for years, an experience you had while studying Revelation, or even the very first time you heard about the mark of the beast and felt that there was something there that deserved to be understood more carefully. When you share something like that, you're not just leaving a comment on a video, you're helping build a larger conversation, a community of people who are also trying to understand these symbols more deeply. And something interesting happens when more and more people begin to take part in that conversation. The platform's algorithm starts to recognize that there's real interest in this kind of content. So when you leave a comment or simply click the like button, you're helping this video reach other people who may be asking the very same questions you are. People who grew up hearing certain interpretations, but who now want to look at these biblical texts with a little more patience, trying to separate tradition, symbolism, and history. That's how this kind of reflection stays alive here. And if you feel that this type of conversation, one that blends Christian spirituality, biblical investigation, and historical interpretations like those discussed within the Vatican, is something worth following, then subscribing to the channel simply becomes a natural step, not as an obligation, but as a way for us to keep walking together on this journey of discovery. Because the more we look at the book of Revelation, the more we realize that it isn't just a text about the future. It's also a mirror showing how each generation interprets the signs around them. And it's exactly when we return to the biblical text itself that something even more intriguing begins to stand out. A specific detail, hidden in just a few words of Revelation, that could completely change the way many people understand the famous mark mentioned there. When we return to the text of Revelation itself and read calmly those words that have been repeated for so long in sermons, movies, and theories, something interesting begins to appear. The passage says that everyone would receive a mark on the right hand or on the forehead, and that without this mark, no one would be able to buy or sell. For years, this sentence was interpreted almost automatically as a physical system of control, something that would one day be implanted into people's bodies. But when you look at the biblical context more carefully, you begin to notice that there may be a detail there that many people overlooked. In the ancient world, especially within the Jewish tradition from which Revelation emerges, symbolic language was far more common than we tend to imagine today. The Bible is full of expressions that speak about the heart, the hands, the eyes, the ears, and most of the time, those terms are not used only in a literal sense. They point to something deeper, something connected to inner transformation, to a person's mindset, to the decisions that shape a life. And this is exactly where an interesting shift begins in the way we look at this famous mark. Because when the text mentions the right hand and the forehead, it may be echoing a symbolic language that already existed long before the book of Revelation was written. In the book of Deuteronomy, for example, there is a moment when God instructs the people of Israel to keep his words as a sign on their hand and as a reminder between their eyes. That wasn't a chip, and it wasn't an implanted object. It was a symbolic way of saying that truth should guide both a person's actions and their thoughts. The hand represented what someone does in the world, the actions, the choices, the practical decisions that shape reality. The forehead symbolized the mind, identity, the way someone thinks and interprets life. So when the author of Revelation uses those exact same images, hand and forehead, he may be doing something far more sophisticated than simply describing a physical object. He may be describing a type of loyalty, a kind of allegiance that begins in the mind and later appears in a person's actions. It may sound like a small detail, but the impact of that interpretation is enormous, because if the mark of the beast is not only something technological, if it also represents a kind of inner alignment with certain systems of power, then the text of Revelation suddenly gains another layer of meaning. The conversation is no longer just about a device or a visible sign. It begins to involve human choices, convictions, and the paths each generation decides to follow. Many Christian theologians throughout history noticed exactly this. In older commentaries on Revelation, the idea appears frequently that the mark of the beast represents an allegiance to a system of evil, an identification with values and structures that stand against the truth of God. It's not merely something placed on the skin, it's something revealed in the way people think and act. Once that perspective begins to unfold, something changes in the entire journey of interpretation. What once seemed like a prophecy about a mechanism of control begins to look more like a spiritual portrait of humanity standing before major decisions. Decisions that shape history, decisions that often unfold behind the scenes of societies, in collective choices, in the mindsets that dominate an era. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because when some scholars connected to the tradition of the Church examined this symbolic language, they noticed that the mark of the beast appears in Revelation almost as a counterpart to another very important symbol, a symbol that almost no one talks about when discussing this subject. The biblical text mentions not only the mark of the beast, but also something called the seal of God, a sign that identifies those who remain faithful even in times of pressure, confusion, and oppressive power. Suddenly, the entire scene shifts. The narrative stops being only about a dark system and begins to reveal something much bigger, a kind of silent struggle for the spiritual identity of human beings. And maybe this is exactly where the most important question begins to emerge. Because if the mark represents loyalty, mindset, and choices that eventually become visible in actions, then the real question is not only how that mark appears, but why so many people would be willing to accept it. This is the moment where the interpretation of Revelation begins to touch something deeply human, something that crosses eras, cultures, and political systems. At its core, the text seems to speak about how each generation responds when confronted with power, pressure, and seductive promises of security or prosperity. And when you start to see it from that perspective, the mark of the beast stops being just a distant symbol of the future. It begins to reflect something that is also connected to the decisions that shape history. If this reflection made sense to you so far, write a simple phrase in the comments. I'm on this journey too. When this perspective begins to come into view, something inside the traditional interpretation of Revelation starts to shift, quietly but deeply, because for a long time, the conversation about the mark of the beast has been trapped inside a single question. What will the object be? What system will it involve? What technology will be behind it all? But when we step back and look at the broader theological tradition, we begin to realize that many Christian thinkers understood this question in a much wider way. Across the centuries, theologians, scholars, and spiritual leaders connected to the tradition of the Church reflected deeply on the symbols found in Revelation. They weren't living in a world of microchips, satellites, or artificial intelligence, and yet, as they studied the text carefully, they noticed something that is still discussed today. In many ancient commentaries, the mark of the beast appears as a sign of submission, not only a physical mark, but a spiritual choice that reveals the mindset of the person who accepts it. This interpretation becomes even more compelling when we look at a detail that often slips past readers who move too quickly through the book of Revelation. The text doesn't speak only about the mark of the beast, it also introduces another powerful symbol that runs parallel to the story, the seal of God. In several passages, Revelation describes people being marked on their foreheads with this seal as a form of spiritual identification. It's not presented as a visible stamp for the entire world to see. It's a symbolic image representing belonging, loyalty, and alignment with what the text presents as divine truth. And this is exactly where a contrast emerges that completely reshapes the perspective of the story. On one side, the seal of God. On the other, the mark of the beast. Two signs, two identities, two possible paths within the human journey. When early theologians began reflecting on this symbolic opposition, many of them realized that Revelation might be describing something far greater than a simple mechanism of economic control. The text seems to point to a deep conflict that stretches across generations, cultures, and systems of power, a struggle for humanity's loyalty, and that realization begins to shift the way we understand these prophetic images. Because if the mark represents submission to a corrupted system of values, and the seal represents faithfulness to the truth of God, then the conflict described in Revelation stops being just a distant futuristic event. It becomes a portrait of the human condition when faced with profound choices involving mindset, convictions, courage, and sometimes resistance in the face of collective pressure. Now I want to go even deeper into This all because when some scholars examined the symbols of Revelation within the historical context in which the book was written, they noticed something even more intriguing. During the time of the Roman Empire, there was enormous pressure for people to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor. In some regions, that loyalty was expressed through public rituals, symbolic declarations, and even marks that indicated belonging to certain structures of power. This doesn't mean that Revelation is describing only that specific historical moment, but it reveals that the author was likely speaking into a very real situation that the first Christian communities were facing: political pressure, social pressure, religious pressure. In other words, people being placed before a quiet but incredibly powerful choice: remain faithful to their convictions or adapt to a dominant system that demanded submission. Once this historical lens enters the conversation, the narrative of Revelation becomes far more human. It stops feeling like a distant prophecy and begins to reflect something that has accompanied human history for centuries: the tension between truth and power, between conscience and convenience, between faithfulness and conformity. And maybe this is the moment when many people begin to realize that for a long time they understood the mark of the beast in a way that was far too superficial. Not because technology couldn't play some role in future systems, but because the heart of the message seems to point to something much deeper. Within this tradition of interpretation, the mark may represent something that begins in the mindset and later reveals itself through decisions, behaviors, and the choices people make when facing the pressures of the world. And when you start looking at Revelation through that perspective, something almost unavoidable begins to form in the mind. If there is a system seeking people's loyalty, and if there is a seal that represents faithfulness to God, then the real question may never have been simply identifying a visible mark. The real question may be about the kind of inner transformation that leads someone to align with one side or the other in this great spiritual narrative. And it is precisely at this point that even deeper insights begin to emerge when we examine how the Church itself has dealt with sensational interpretations throughout history. Because there is a very specific reason why many theological authorities have always been extremely cautious when the subject involves end times prophecy. If this reflection made you see this subject in a different light, write a simple phrase in the comments below: "This makes sense to me." When this idea begins to fall into place, another layer of the story quietly starts to emerge. Because if you look at the background of the Christian tradition across the centuries, you'll notice that there has always been a great deal of caution when it comes to the book of Revelation. And that didn't happen by accident. The Church itself learned, often in the hardest possible ways, that rushed apocalyptic interpretations can generate confusion, fear, and sometimes even collective decisions that turn out to be deeply misguided. At different moments in history, people appeared who were absolutely convinced they had decoded every symbol in Revelation. Some claimed they knew exactly who the beast was. Others were certain they had discovered the precise date of the end of the world. There were even periods when entire crowds prepared themselves for apocalyptic events that simply never happened. Those episodes left deep marks on theological reflection, and it was precisely because of experiences like these that many scholars connected to the Church's tradition began to approach Revelation with much greater caution, not as a forbidden or irrelevant book, but as a text filled with symbols that must be interpreted carefully. At first glance, that approach might seem less exciting, especially for those who are used to dramatic theories promising to reveal hidden secrets about the end of the world. But when you look at it more closely, you begin to see that there is a very deep logic behind it. Over the centuries, theologians connected to the Vatican often emphasized three important principles when dealing with Revelation. The first is recognizing that the language used in this book is highly symbolic. The images of beasts, seals, trumpets, and marks were not written as a technical manual about future events. They belong to an ancient literary style known as apocalyptic literature, which uses powerful symbols to communicate profound spiritual messages. The second point involves prudence. Human instinct often pushes us to immediately match every symbol with a specific event, a specific ruler, or a specific technology. But history repeatedly shows that this kind of rushed interpretation almost always ends up being disproven by time itself. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because when we examine the reflections of some Christian thinkers about Revelation, we begin to realize that the central purpose of this book may have been misunderstood in many modern discussions. Revelation was not written primarily to fuel fear or paranoia. It emerged during a time when Christian communities were facing persecution, political pressure, and deep uncertainty about the future. Within that context, the symbolic imagery worked as a powerful form of encouragement. It reminded believers that despite the apparent forces of evil moving through history, faithfulness to God was still the path that ultimately led to true victory. And that completely shifts the center of the conversation, because once this perspective enters the picture, the question is no longer simply, what technology will be used to mark people? That question, while intriguing, begins to look secondary compared to something far greater. A deeper question starts to emerge. What kind of spiritual faithfulness is Revelation trying to reveal within the human journey? What kind of mindset is the text trying to form in those who read it? Perhaps the true impact of Revelation is not about predicting future mechanisms of control, but about exposing something that runs through every era of history, the human capacity to align with systems of power that promise security, prosperity, or belonging, even when those promises conflict with truth. This tension appears again and again throughout the history of civilizations. Empires rise, structures of power solidify, collective mentalities take shape, and eventually every generation faces a decision about how far it is willing to go to adapt to those structures. It's at this point that the narrative of Revelation takes on an almost universal dimension. It speaks about choices, about quiet decisions that shape both personal and collective destinies, about the inner transformation that happens when someone decides where their true loyalty belongs. And when you begin to see it from that perspective, something becomes increasingly intriguing. Revelation doesn't only describe an evil system trying to dominate the world, it also describes how that system manages to win the allegiance of so many people. That may be one of the most unsettling insights in the text. The power of the beast does not appear only through force or violence. It appears through the ability to seduce, to persuade, to shape mindsets, and to create a sense of normality around decisions that, in another context, would seem unthinkable. And when that realization begins to surface, a new question inevitably starts to take shape within the journey of interpretation itself. If Revelation describes systems capable of influencing minds and winning loyalties, then the real mystery may not lie only in the mark itself. The real mystery may lie in how these structures of power manage to convince so many people to accept it without even realizing what is truly happening. If this reflection stirred something inside you, write a simple phrase in the comments. This makes sense to me. When this entire journey of interpretation begins to unfold before us, a realization appears that surprises many people. Despite nearly 2,000 years of study, theological debate, biblical commentary, and deep reflection within the Christian tradition, the book of Revelation remains one of the most mysterious texts in the entire Bible. And that isn't a mistake or a failure of interpretation. Quite the opposite. Many scholars connected to the Church's tradition openly recognize that the symbols in Revelation were written in a way that reaches across generations. They speak to people from different eras, different historical contexts, and different systems of power. That means some of the images described there may carry more than one layer of meaning, one layer that made sense to the first Christians living under the pressure of the Roman Empire, another layer that can speak to later generations facing new systems of domination, new structures of power, and new moral decisions within the flow of history. This way of reading opens the door to a much broader perspective than the simplified view that often appears in popular discussions. Revelation is not just a secret code waiting to be deciphered once and for all. It works almost like a spiritual mirror that reveals recurring patterns in the human experience. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because when some theologians studied the full structure of Revelation, they began to notice that the symbols presented there seem to revolve around three major dimensions of the human journey. The first dimension is spiritual. The text constantly speaks about loyalty, worship, identity, and belonging. It suggests that the greatest battle does not take place only in political or economic arenas, but within human conscience itself. The second dimension involves systems of power. Revelation describes empires, dominant structures, authorities that influence crowds and shape collective mindsets. These systems appear as forces capable of pressuring individuals to align themselves with certain decisions, often promising security, prosperity, or stability. And the third dimension involves something deeply human: choice. Choices that every generation must make in the face of those pressures. Choices that shape not only the destiny of individuals, but the direction of entire civilizations. When these three dimensions intersect, spirituality, power, and human decision, the symbol of the mark of the beast begins to gain a depth that goes far beyond any superficial explanation. It may represent a point where these forces converge, a moment when collective mentality, structures of power, and personal choices meet in a decisive way. That helps explain why many scholars throughout history avoided treating this symbol as something merely technical or mechanical, because the real impact of revelation seems to lie less in revealing a specific object and more in exposing the spiritual dynamics that shape the great turning points of history. And when you begin to see it from that perspective, a question starts to rise with even greater intensity. Maybe the central question was never simply identifying what the mark will be. Maybe the deeper question is understanding why so many people would be willing to accept it. That question touches something very delicate within the human journey, because throughout history, entire civilizations have embraced ideas, systems, and leaders that at certain moments seemed unavoidable, structures that promised stability, order, or progress, yet at the same time demanded a kind of total alignment of mindset and behavior. And that is exactly where Revelation becomes such a powerful text. It doesn't only describe future events, it reveals patterns that seem to repeat throughout the story of societies. Patterns involving seduction, influence, collective pressure, and decisions that gradually shape the identity of a people. When this lens begins to open, the mark of the beast stops being just an isolated mystery and becomes part of a much larger narrative. A narrative involving power, faith, resistance, and inner transformation. And maybe that is why, even after so many centuries, the book of Revelation continues to provoke questions that echo in the minds of those who choose to look at its message carefully, because the more we observe its symbols, the more we realize that they are connected to each other in surprising ways. The mark, the beast, the empires described in the prophetic visions, the alliances between political and spiritual forces, everything seems to belong to the same symbolic panorama. And when those pieces begin to come together, connections start to appear that many people simply never had the chance to notice before. If this reflection awakened something in your own journey of understanding, write a simple phrase in the comments: "I'm on this journey too." And if you've made it this far in the conversation, walking through each of these ideas slowly, maybe it's because something in this topic stirred something inside you as well. Maybe an old curiosity, maybe a question you once had while reading the book of Revelation, or maybe that quiet feeling that behind these symbols there's a much larger story than the one we usually hear. Because in the end, this journey isn't only about identifying a mark, decoding a symbol, or trying to predict future events. It's also about understanding how faith, human decisions, and systems of power intersect throughout history. And when we start looking at all of this a little more carefully, many things begin to come into clearer focus. If this reflection stayed with you all the way to this point, leave a simple phrase in the comments just so I know you reached the end of today's journey. You could write something like, "I'm with you to the end," or even, "This message was meant for me." Sometimes a single sentence like that is enough to show that this conversation resonated with others who are also trying to understand these themes more deeply. And if at any point during this video you felt that this kind of conversation, calmer, more investigative, looking behind the scenes of faith, history, and biblical prophecy, speaks to you, then subscribing to the channel simply becomes a way to keep following these reflections from here on out, not as an obligation, but as someone choosing to keep exploring together the questions that have crossed centuries. In the same way, when you leave a like on the video, something interesting happens. That small gesture helps the platform recognize that this kind of content really matters to the people watching, and because of that, it can begin reaching others who might be asking the very same questions you are. And before you leave, take a look at the video appearing right here on the side. It connects directly with everything we've just talked about and goes even deeper into some of these ideas about the symbols of Revelation and the interpretations that have traveled through history. Click on it and continue with me there. Because when we start connecting all these symbols, the beast, the empires, the prophetic alliances, and the signs described in Revelation, some connections begin to appear in ways that almost no one ever talks about.